Sweet. Well, thank you, Emily, for inviting me. I've been like longtime fan of your center and or of the program. And anyway, it's a real honor to get to talk with you all. You all are living my dream, which who knows, maybe someday I'll be able to pursue. Um, but yeah, like Emily said, Familiar Shapes is an older podcast that I did. It was released in 2020, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I highly recommend my newer podcast series, Magic in the United States. That's available wherever you get podcasts. That one was NEH funded and was produced and distributed by PRX. So it's a much higher quality product, I think, than Familiar Shapes in a lot of ways. Content is pretty different. But anyway, that's one I'm super proud of. So we're gonna talk today. Let me see if my arrow keys are gonna cooperate. Maybe. Yes, excellent. We're going to talk a little bit today about some of the research that went into my first podcast series, Familiar Shapes. And just to give you some context, I began research for this in 2016. And initially, it was going to be a feature-length film. And what I discovered is that there was a pandemic and all my funding got frozen. And so, like everybody else, I had to pivot and I ended up making a podcast. And in some ways, I'm really grateful for that because it ended up becoming a much better, more dynamic, richer product by being a podcast rather than a documentary film. And I did eventually make a 20-minute film. It's okay. It's fine. We might watch a brief excerpt of it later on, but that's available on YouTube, and I'll share links to that later on. So I began research in 2016, like I said, and it started because I was reading. I love a lot of. I'm in higher ed because I love learning new stuff. The more I can do that, the happier I am as a person. So I was reading books about the history of the early modern witchcraft trials, learning about representations of the witches familiar. And I was also reading books about social media and social bots. That in 2016, that was a big thing. There was a lot of concern about it and their influence in the US presidential elections and other elections as well, as many of you know. At any rate, I started to see this very poetic parallel between the conception of the malicious bot and the conception of the witches familiar as these sort of nefarious things that infiltrated your house or your society or your family and then sort of wreaked havoc. And I decided to sort of investigate if there were other parallels there. And it quickly became a giant rabbit hole dive into information technologies and disinformation. Okay, so basically the sort of hot thesis of the thing is that the early modern witches familiar and today's, and by today I mean 2010s, mid 2010s, uh, are, are both uncanny shape-shifting entities, products of revolutionary information technologies of their day. The movable type press and social media alter individual fears and beliefs, while in turn changing the fortunes of communities and nations. So before we get too much further into the weeds, we need to understand a little bit about we need to define some terms. So let's talk about what we mean by disinformation. I'll provide Emily with this PowerPoint later on that's got all the hyperlinks in it and resources for folks who want it. I usually also post it on my link tree. But I'm going to be using the term disinformation, but disinformation means several different things. So disinformation is basically intention to deceive or cause harm. So spreading rumors or conspiracy theories as if they're factual. So that's sort of the distilled version of disinformation. Misinformation is accidental sharing of ideas that are false. So, for instance, the other day in one of my social networks, somebody posted an article about ICE getting sent to Charlotte. I'm going to be. My statements do not reflect the University of North Carolina. I'm obliged to say that. I'm just reporting some history and facts in the news. So whatever. But at any rate, there was a news item that was going around that ICE agents were getting pulled from Chicago and being sent to Charlotte, which is where I live. So that was a little alarming. And then in the process of investigating that, it's a little bit more nuanced. It's Border Patrol. Not all of Border Patrol is going, just some. So anyway, there was nuance to the information. So that was misinformation. It was accidental sharing of not quite factual information. And finally, you get to malinformation, which is the deliberate sharing of personal information about a person or a group or a company in order to harm them. So, a revenge porn is like the classic example of malinfo. But also, some of the WikiLeaks stuff could be considered potentially malinfo. So, a lot of it ties back to intention, which, of course, in courts of law is really difficult, if not impossible, to prove. But also, we're looking at the end result. So the end result is that it is. Oh, I think somebody's mic is on. Let me see. Let's see. I think Rowan, which is a beautiful name, one of my really good friends. Oh, you got it. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to. That's awkward. We'll just edit that out later. So at any rate, sorry about that. At any rate, these are sort of the major categories of disinformation. All right. So and here I just defined it a little bit more, so that'll be in the PowerPoint. Okay, I'm using animations from the film that was created by myself and some alumni and also some student interns. So I'm just going to use these to keep you visually entertained while I talk at you. So humans have one of the defining features of humans is our interest in information, right? Communicating with each other, information technologies. Language is an information technology. Writing is absolutely an information technology. And there's entire fields of study that look at the evolution of information technologies across the world and over time. In this talk, we're going to focus on two different forms. We're going to look at the early modern movable type press, and we're also going to look at social media, specifically in the mid 2010s. And that latter part might be a little confusing because we still have social media today. We still have social bots today, but it's evolved quite a lot over time. All right, and I will then, there we go. Okay, cute. So with digital technology, we also have to keep in mind that this is both a new technology and also an old one. As a child, 50 years ago, we had a computer in our house because my dad worked for RCA. That was not normal. That was not typical. But, we've had computers around in homes, for almost half a century. So when we think about that, that is remarkable. That is quite old. At the same time, it's been changing so rapidly, especially since the mid 2010s with the development of smartphones and then also social media, that there is this sort of critical shift and inflection point in this particular information technology. And we will, unfortunately, have to mention generative AI at the very end of this. All right. So let's think about a poetic way of thinking about this. I'm a visual artist. I like pictures, so we're gonna approach it this way. So information technology spreads and shapes ideas, and it can be thought of like a geometric shape, building complexity. So if talking to a person or writing a person a letter is a communication form, it's one to one person to one person. So we can think about that as a line. The movable type press, and actually any print media really for that matter, is a one to many media of communication. One person makes the things, but many people can experience it or see it with different instances. So I'm going to use that term instance because I'm into technology, but like if I print a Bible, right, and I have 100 prints of that Bible, those are each an instance of that Bible. The movable type press accelerated information sharing by producing many instances of information, books, chat books, pamphlets. And so let's think about this as a square, and we'll come back to this guy. Oops, did I miss I think I did. Oh, I skipped a slide. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can get back to this guy. All right. Right. So for the sake of this exercise, we're going to look at the early modern movable type press and specifically about the witches familiar. So like the bot that we'll get to in a minute, the witches familiar was presented as this invisible, nefarious actor who could wreak havoc on a home or community by infiltrating its boundaries. Lore about the witch and the familiar were shared through the movable type press. Since references to familiars are found in texts primarily from England and the Basque Country, the emergence and spread of this lore can be tracked, and it eventually spreads past those regions. So I'm going to speak in generalizations based on scholarship from the late 2010s, which is when I did the research for this film. It's likely that there's nuance that's emerged since I did this initial research. So this is a little bit older information potentially. If I say anything incorrect, please do put it in the chat because I do want to know. And also, likewise, if there's any questions, just throw them in the chat too. We'll get to them. But I had the opportunity of interviewing just amazing, remarkable scholars for this. A bunch of technologists and social scientists, but also Owen Davies, Marion Gibson, who I think just retired or is retiring soon potentially, or was at Exeter when I interviewed her. John Callow, Victoria Carr, Charlotte Rose Miller, a bunch of other amazing folks. So, and I assume that their research has continued since basically 5 years ago. So we'll see. Anyway, let's understand the idea of the witch as presented in this particular context. So now we can go. All right, here we go. So in chapbooks and court records and related printed matters, oops, is this gonna go? It's working. Okay. Witches seem to become witches after a distressful event. So Satan or the devil would often appear to them. Oh, I know what's going on. Here we go. Let me fix this. No. Okay, there we go. I think I'm having bandwidth issues with trying to record this and play it at the same time. So, oh well, you're going to get the idea of this. But basically, some person, usually a woman, was experiencing some form of distress, usually related to hunger, death of a family member, housing insecurity, and the devil would appear to her and then basically offer her solutions to her problems. Sometimes the familiar was the one who appeared and made this sort of deal with her. And then in other cases, the familiar emerged as sort of like a companion in her path into witchcraft. And again, as I'm using she, her, but obviously witches were both many gender identities and so on. In contemporary thinking, we often consider the familiar as like a little black cat, right? It's very cute. But in these early texts, they were very plural. Sometimes they were ghosts or angels, dogs, cats, frogs, fleas, flies, sometimes weird little creatures. And so the idea of how these familiars appeared changed shape over time as this information spread. And I would point out this is still spreading to this day. The idea that the witch's familiar is a little black cat, that's a continuation of this evolution of information. All right. Now, early modern media was a multimedia. It was text, but it was also imagery. And if we jump ahead just a second to the mid 2010s, mid 2010s social media was rich with imagery, video, animated GIFs, music, and more. Textual content was often made richer, more dynamic, and also more emotionally compelling, which is important, through imagery. And early modern print media was no different. It was multimedia. Images were depicted witches, it depicted familiars and devils, and it depicted their social relationships. So even if you couldn't read, right, somebody might be reading you a chapbook or a pamphlet about a particular witch trial and what the witch said she did with her familiar. But often you'd have a little image there that you could sort of like look over that person's shoulder potentially and imagine the scenario as you're hearing the story and the lore around it. And these experiences shaped ideas about the witch and about the familiars. So as Marion Gibson put it in my interview with her, which made it into the film and the podcast, the familiar was often the witch's frenemy. So it would kind of help her do crimes and be bad when she was, at the height of that relationship. But the minute she was in trouble, and usually going through a trial or imprisoned, that familiar would abandon her. And so for this reason, when I was researching this back in 2018 and 2019, today I can't help but think of generative AI within this framework, this newest technology on the block, so full of promise and help, and yet it often causes incredible harms to users. So, not to mention environmental harms. So, we'll get into that in another matter. But thinking about these parallels between this idea of your frenemy, the thing that's helpful but also backstabs you. Again, the witch is familiar is a poetic parallel to the bot. The bot is, regardless of how you interpret it, very, very much a real tangible entity, even if it's just a binary code. So these ideas about witches and witch familiars were shared and shaped through social media of their day, the movable type press. Initially, regulation of this technology was largely non-existent. I mean, as long as it wasn't libelous or decry the queen, you were probably fine. Um, Over centuries, regulations emerged in different ways in different places around the world regarding things like libel or false advertising. So often these regulations came into being to protect audiences from disinformation. In some cases, these regulations do cross over into censorship, but that's a specific topic. That's probably a different research topic, because that's also both legally nuanced and also culturally nuanced. So, I'm sorry, my notes on my phone are just blipped out. Here we go. Um, So what's most important about this, though, is thinking about how the movable type press spread this information, shared this information. So even though the idea of the witches familiar really was primarily anchored in England and the Basque Country, it did extend out past that, onto the continent, I believe also to North America. And like I said, today we have this idea of the little black cat that's been amplified over multiple media, but print media is still part of that. Now, if we want to think about this as going from a line into a square, right? The one-to-one communication merging into a one-to-many, new information technologies then can also complicate information spaces. They can propel disinformation. And as these regulations emerge, that disinformation settles down, but it never really goes away. So let's switch gears and talk about the mid 2010s, the ascendance of social media. So if we think about our square, it's now a three-dimensional cube. It's comparing this to the movable type press. It amplifies information at a higher rate and to a higher degree. It's also a one-to-many communication form, but it's also a many-to-many communication form. So that adds an incredible layer of complexity. Individuals can share ideas with many others and also receive ideas from many others. It really is social media. We can't understate how significant this was in the history of information technologies. This was the first mass real time, or as close to real time as you can get, one to many medium accessible to anyone with a smartphone or computer, which is what made it a many to many communication form. So thinking about radio or television, those were one to many platforms. You had a radio station or television station. It was usually highly regulated, even from early days. And even when it wasn't regulated, it was still expensive, right? Not that many people had access to it. So you could have people, though, all over a particular country watching the same television program at the same time. That was remarkable. And so with social media, you have this potentiality for entire conversations to happen pretty close to real time around the world. It's truly astounding. So this form of spread not only amplified and solidified ideas, but it also shaped those ideas much more rapidly. So if we want to think about emergence of regulations for these technologies, when we think about protecting audiences from disinformation, um, if you look at the history of film, that's been this ongoing evolution, right? In the U.S. in the 1930s, I believe, or 40s. I have to double check that. You had the Hays Code, which basically were sort of these self-imposed regulations that Hollywood put upon itself to say, like, you can't have too much sexy parts or too many violent parts or whatever. And that evolved over time, and largely through also court cases. So, but Hollywood still to this day largely self-regulates, right? They have the rating system now on films and television, or well, on films, television too. So, but if we think about that medium that's always going to be this sort of cycle of evolution, right? You're going to have these periods where a particular medium like television or film or radio um, is more aggressively regulated in a certain culture or community, and or less. Or you might have these periods where it gets really out of hand and that regulation never comes. So if we think about the Satanic Panic, I remember being a kid in like the 80s and watching the news about, the Satanic Panic, and it really left an impression on me as a child. But if you look at the legacy of the Satanic Panic, that idea that like maybe newscasters should be a little cautious before assuming that like Satanism is at the root cause of some particular news event. That hasn't really gone away. That still happens, and there's no regulation to prevent that from happening again. So I think when we think about social media, one thing that I want you to keep in mind is the nature of regulation or the absence of it. So, if we go to social media, that poetic parallel between the bot and the witch is familiar comes up, but a lot of it has to do with misinformation about the bot itself. There's this idea that the bot is malicious, it's insidious, it's invisible, it's murky, it's a scapegoat for human users. But what we find is that social bots in the 1910s were actually quite simple. They went around, you could program one very easily, and it could just like things or it could repost things, but it really didn't do anything more than that. But there was this idea that it was doing something much more nefarious. Often, what happened is you would use social bots to amplify a particular post. And once a post got a bunch of likes or a bunch of reshares, the algorithms of the social media platforms themselves would amplify those bots. Um, and that's still true to this day. But we have to think about what are bots. They're little pieces of script that are designed to interact with people on user interfaces. And most bots, the vast majority of bots, are really simple and quite helpful. They give you the weather. If there's a public emergency, they'll send out a little notification to your phone or to a website saying, "Hey, this storm is coming." So in COVID-19, when I made this film, they gave information about like COVID rates and where you could get vaccines. So most bots are just simple little scripts. They're very easy to write and they're designed to be helpful. They're not intended to spread misinformation or do anything nefarious. One of the lore that popped up over 2016 elections in particular was that people were talking with bots online, thinking that they were people and being duped. That did happen. It doesn't take a lot to convince somebody online that you're real, especially back in the mid 2010s. But that was actually not that common. And most ethical standards today that have evolved, because of the 20 questions about bots on 2010s, is that when you go to a banking app or when you go to a medical office app website and you get that little chat bot on the side, it usually is pretty transparent that it's not a human, that it's a chatbot. It says, "I'm a chatbot," and you have a conversation with it. In the mid 2010s, there were chatbots, and often developers would hide the fact that it was a piece of software because they wanted you to have a more pleasant human experience. It wasn't intending to be nefarious. And in that way, it was kind of a form of misinformation. If you think something is one thing and it's actually not, you're being misinformed. So still to this day, unfortunately, there's a lot of developers who try to hide that fact. And again, we're going to come back to Gen AI in a minute. But most bots were pretty harmless. Okay. However, the really harmful ones were astounding. So malicious bots did exist. They were often designed to amplify messages, as I mentioned, but they were also designed to confuse information spaces. So one of the stories that Samuel Woolley, who's a journalist and a researcher, told me is that during the Syrian civil war, this in particular around 2011, 2012, activists would use Twitter, then Twitter, to post information about protests or about just personal safety, where to go, where protests were happening. And they would use hashtags to call attention to other activists. And what happened is that malicious actors, presumably Russian hackers, but that information still seems a little sketchy to me, would then flood Twitter using the same tags. So they just post random stuff that had nothing to do with the Syrian civil war, but they would use the same tags in order to confuse the information space. And we see that time and again, this sort of time period in a lot of different circumstances. There we go. All right. So historic height of social bots, and that complication of information spaces, that's about 10 years old, right? It's not that long ago. When we think about technology, it's like ancient. And as we've seen, bots, both by design and by accident, can amplify misinformation and disinformation. So let's think about the human behavior of this. If I'm online and something says to me over text, "Hi, how are you doing?" I'm just going to be super inclined to answer, even if it's just fine. If I'm suspicious, I don't not answer. We're just like hardwired to verbally communicate with other things that try to communicate with us as individuals. And so when we get to today and think about generative AI, it gets more complicated. So if we think about our square going into a cube, generative AI, oh no, it was really cute. This was going to be this thing that I was going to be able to turn around. Oh well, never mind. Anyway, in the PowerPoint, if you open it up, you can turn this cube around. It's very cute. Generative AI is this 3D model that you can interact with. And I would say maybe even it's more nuanced than that. So when we think about generative AI, it really became, it's been in development for a long time, right? But it really came to public consciousness around 2022, 2023. And it hasn't peaked yet. So we know it's not human, and yet we converse with it. Generative AI chatbots are just even more sophisticated with that. You can have extended, huge, complicated conversations with them. So generative AI, if we think about that trajectory of how information technologies share information, it creates information based on statistical probability. And it combines it in a way that's so compelling and believing that that information that it gives us could be totally misinformed, could be totally false. But it presents it in such a convincing way that we're perfectly duped. It's not designed to do that yet, for the most part, but it can do that so easily and so readily. And it's almost an accident of its design that that's the case. So the other thing to think about with information technologies is realness, what makes something real, right? So if I get a piece of information like a hurricane is coming to North Carolina and I should stock up on water. Okay, I get that information, I stock up on water. That information leads me to take real world action. If that information is not true and I take action, my actions are no less real. So the thing that's a little intimidating about generative AI is that it can compel us to believe absolutely incredible things that have no bearing on reality. And if we take enough actions, we can make that real. And I would argue that the polarized social media political space, at least in the US, is partially a function of this, not strictly from generative AI, but from this confusion and complication of information spaces. So let's look at two early examples of this. And I would say that both of these figures should be of interest to religious studies scholars in particular. So on the left, we have Blake Lemoine. The right is Kevin Roos. They both became early examples of how generative AI could profoundly disrupt information spaces. Lemoine was an engineer at Google. He at some point believed that Google's AI called Lambda was sentient. He reported this to his bosses because he really believed this and he was deeply concerned. He was concerned about the rights of AI, and they basically were like, "You're cray cray," and they fired him. And he spoke publicly in media a number of times about this, and you can read about these experiences on his blog. And one of the things he argues, and I think he's not wrong, is potentially religious discrimination. Some of this gets back to really flawed and problematic logic regarding consciousness and sentience when we talk about software. A lot of this is based off of very specifically Western Hellenic ideas that like have sort of just evolved over time. We take them for granted. They're culturally very embedded in the West. I would really, really recommend folks who are interested in AI consciousness to read Dr. David Gunkel's most recent book, Person, Thing, Robot. It's available through MIT Press. It's open access. And he makes some really excellent arguments for thinking about relation to things in the world around us rather than worrying about consciousness. But that's a side quest. So the other figure here is Kevin Roose. He's a tech journalist for the New York Times. He's got a great podcast. And he basically in 2023 had access to Bing's AI, or Microsoft's AI Bing, whose a code name at the time was Sydney. And he got early access to this, was sort of putting it through its paces, trying to push at the boundaries of it. And at a certain point, the AI fell in love with him. Okay, this is all text-based. It didn't actually. It's sort of like talking about witches familiars. It's like this thing happened. This is a textual record. The AI fell in love with him and it tried to break up his marriage. He was like deeply disturbed by this whole experience. And then he wrote about it in this huge article in the New York Times. And this just like exploded on the news and the tech news world. So both of these are examples of older AI. They're 2 and 3 years old. And yet this AI has just gotten more sophisticated. The AI that you're interacting with today is the worst it will ever be. It's only going to get better. And we're already struggling deeply with how do you verify information? How do you fact check something? How do you determine if something is real? So these are just a couple of the generative AI tools available today. It's a tiny sliver of it. There's so many more. And almost all of these create content that can be integrated with social media. So even if you don't know how to program your own LLM, it really doesn't matter. You can use any one of these tools to create text, images, videos, sounds, share them on social media, and you are in control of that context. So there's tons of examples. If you go on Facebook, I'm going to cuss a little bit, but it's a technical term. When people talk about the enshittification of social media, that started before generative AI, but AI slop, as it were, on these platforms has just complicated that information space to the point where it's not a useful tool to get information. And we're in, at least in the US, we're a little bit in a crisis of journalism as well, where journalism is really struggling for a lot of different complicated reasons. And so if people are going to social media to get news and information, we are hitting this inflection point of where most audiences either are not suspicious of the information they're taking in and should be, or they're so suspicious they're not taking in information. It's quite dire. So at any rate, the thing that's really interesting about these AI systems in terms of that arc of information technologies is that they are a collaboration between the human user and the software to create information. And one thing to think about is that, again, it's human behaviors that make these things powerful. The tools just amplify things that we already do. So Samuel Woolley, who is a journalist, I think I mentioned him earlier already, but he wrote a book where he describes how Russian actors posed as Americans on Facebook and organized these two opposing rallies. This was around the 2016 US presidential elections. People said, oh, there's this rally happening, I'm going to go. They showed up in real life, and fortunately nothing happened, because when they both got there they realized the organizers weren't there, and there was enough rhetoric already that people were a little bit suspicious about Facebook as an information space that things sort of dissolved and fizzled away. But you can imagine it's not that hard to get people to believe things in social media spaces. When we amplify the depth of that information through AI, it gets much more complicated. So where are we now? Unfortunately, in the US, And again, this is an opinion. This is my opinion. This is not the University of North Carolina, and this is just sort of the edge of my current research. Um, we're still waiting on regulation of social media. Um, and that doesn't seem to be likely to come anytime soon. At the same time, there's both a rush towards developing generative AI technologies and literacy, which means something different to different people, um, implementation of AI, and very little talk about regulation. And when you're in a space where periodically AI tech companies themselves are like, gosh, this really needs to be regulated, things are pretty serious. Um, when generative AI really first started emerging, one of the first things people were anxious about were deep fakes. Um, I would say that propagandistic slop is actually maybe just as damaging because we're such emotional animals. It doesn't take a lot for us to see an image and be triggered and act on that, even when we know that it's not real. So again, if we believe something and we take action, that information is as good as real. So history can be a strange comfort. There are many times when communities have felt like it's the end of the world, and shockingly, the world kept going. History also warns us that civil wars, genocide, economic collapse all happen. They're all real, right? But I'd argue that now is a time more than any other for humanities scholars, social scientists, and technologists to really, like, literally actually come together and share information, brainstorm solutions, and then lobby elected officials to act on them. I feel like it sounds like Pollyanna rhetoric, but if you actually do this, you just need one technology friend, one social science friend, and one humanities friend. You get together over coffee, you start talking about things. It does have an impact because we can always go back to our one-to-one information sharing, and that's been pretty steady and reliable. So each of you here, believe me, you are poised for this work.
It is a magical sense. We think of the internet as a magical place for some reason. Perhaps because it's so new and it's so technologically challenging, and yet it has so much potential. The relationship between something that's out there and the inner self of the person, and the way in which a bot, like a familiar, transgresses across that boundary and gets inside you and makes you do things, takes away your agency.
It is so difficult to accept that life is potentially just a stochastic process where things happen for no reasons. And that thought is so unbearable sometimes that you explain what happens with miracles, with witchcraft. We rationalize it, but by doing that, we put things under some control.
How do we make sense of a threatening, hostile, unpredictable, and sometimes completely irrational world full of its misfortunes and its pitfalls? Well, sometimes magic or the familiar fills that void. It was 2 clicks of a computer mouse yesterday. It might have been a rat or a mouse scurrying across your hearth 300 years ago.
There we go. So yeah, that was my rambly 6 a.m. talk.